Welcome back to Creepy Chills. I know some of you use these videos to fall asleep. Before you do, I'd love for you to leave a comment and share where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and relaxed. Let's begin. 2 summers ago, my wife and I were on a cross-country road trip, heading to a big family gathering. We decided to drive so we could stop at a few cities we liked along the way. On the first day, we drove for about 8 or 9 hours before stopping for the night. The second day, we pushed a little farther, driving late into the night. Around 11 p.m., we got off the freeway and onto a quiet highway. There were woods on both sides, and we barely saw any other cars. About 10 minutes in, we saw what looked like a man standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms. I slowed down, and as we got closer, we saw he was an older man, probably in his 70s. He looked like he needed help, so we stopped the car. He came up to my window, and I rolled it down just a bit. He seemed really worried. He told us that his car had run out of gas a little ways back on a side road, and he'd been walking trying to get home. He asked if we could drive him to his house, which he said was just a couple of miles away. My gut reaction was to say no, and honestly, I wish I had. But he looked so harmless, so I figured, why not help him out? I told him to hop in the back, and I'd give him a ride. He got in, thanked us several times, and told us his house was just up the road. He mentioned he had gas in his other truck that he could use for his car. Following his directions, we drove about a mile, then turned onto a quiet road surrounded by thick woods. After a minute or so, he pointed out a driveway and asked us to pull in. I asked if it was his driveway, and he said yes, but asked if we could drive a little farther up. The driveway was narrow and winding, and I couldn't see much because of all the trees. As we kept driving, I started to feel uneasy. Then we reached a clearing, and he said we could drop him off there. As soon as he got out of the car, I saw movement coming from the woods behind us. I glanced forward and saw more movement. Without thinking, I slammed on the gas and threw the car into reverse. My wife started screaming as multiple men came running toward us from both sides. I didn't stop. I backed out of the narrow driveway as fast as I could. One of the men hit my car with something, but I didn't care. I just kept going until we got back to the road and sped off to the highway. My wife was shaking, and honestly, so was I. I don't know what kind of trap that old man was trying to set for us, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never stop to pick anyone up again. Last year, I was on a long road trip for work. I travel a lot for my job, but I'll skip the work details and get right to the story. I left the city I was staying in around 4 p.m., knowing it would be a late-night drive. I didn't expect to get to my hotel until about 2 in the morning. At first, the roads were busy, but as the night went on, they got quieter. By the time it was around 1 in the morning, I was about an hour and a half away from my destination, driving through the middle of nowhere. The roads were almost empty, and I was feeling good, just cruising along. That's when I noticed a car coming up fast behind me. I was already in the right lane, so I figured it would pass by, but instead, it slowed down to match my speed. I glanced over and saw that it was an old, beat-up car with duct tape on one of the windows. What caught my attention more was the driver. He was wearing a skeleton mask. He looked right at me for a second, then sped up and moved ahead, getting about 5 car lengths in front of me. I shook it off, thinking it was weird, but kept driving. Soon, more cars started appearing in my rearview mirror, also moving quickly. The first one passed me, and to my surprise, the driver was also wearing a skeleton mask. That car lined up beside the one in front of me, and then another car passed. Same thing, another skeleton mask. Now, I was getting really freaked out. When I looked behind me, I saw even more cars, all with skeleton mask drivers. I was completely surrounded. I had no idea what was going on or what they wanted. Were they trying to mess with me? Run me off the road? As I kept driving, the cars seemed to get closer. I didn't know what to do, but I hoped an exit would show up soon. After what felt like forever, I finally saw one coming up. I kept my speed steady, and at the last second, I swerved onto the exit ramp. The cars in front of me couldn't make the turn, so I was able to get away, but a bunch of them followed me off the highway. Now, There were about 5 cars still trailing me. One started speeding up, trying to pass. As I frantically looked around, we passed a restaurant and a few businesses, and then I saw a gas station. To my relief, there was a police car parked there. Without thinking twice, I swerved into the station and parked right next to the cop car. A few of the skeleton masked cars pulled in, but they quickly drove through and left. I waited for the officer to come out of the store. When he did, I told him everything. He said he would alert the other police in the area, and even offered to drive a few miles behind me to make sure I wasn't followed again. That's exactly what we did, and I made it to my hotel safely about an hour later. A few years ago, I was on a cross-country road trip because I was moving from one side of the country to the other. It was just me, traveling alone, and I kind of liked living out of my car for a bit. The only issue was that my car was old and barely hanging on. I had planned to buy a new car after the move since I didn't want the hassle of dealing with it right away. For the first part of the trip, the car did okay, but it would sometimes give me trouble. On the third day, it was really hot, and I had been driving almost non-stop for about 10 hours. As night fell, I was driving on a quiet highway, not a main freeway, just one of those roads surrounded by woods. Suddenly, I felt my car start to die. It was about 9 p.m., and the road was empty. I pulled over, hoping the car would start again if I let it rest for a bit. After a few minutes, I tried turning it back on, but nothing happened. I took out my phone to call for help, but of course, I had no service. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to walk a little up the road to see if I could get any signal. As I walked about 20 feet away from the car, checking my phone for bars, I heard a noise coming from the woods. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but when I looked closer, I saw the legs of a man standing behind the trees. I couldn't see much of him, and I had no idea why someone would be out in the woods at that time. It made me feel uneasy, so I quickly walked back to my car, got in, locked the doors, and tried to stay calm. I kept checking my phone, hoping it would get service, and decided to restart it just in case. While I was waiting for it to reboot, I suddenly heard a noise coming from the right side of my car. I looked over and my heart dropped. A man was standing at my passenger window, staring in. He was dirty, shirtless, and looked like he had been in the woods for a while. He started trying to open the door, and when it didn't budge, he began banging on the window. I was frozen in fear at first, but eventually started yelling at him to leave. He didn't seem to care. I tried using my phone again to call the police, but I still had no service. Suddenly, the man stopped banging, ran back toward the woods, and picked up a large stick. He started walking back toward my car. I was terrified and thought about getting out to run, but I didn't have a plan. I just knew I didn't feel safe inside the car anymore. Just as I was about to open my door, I saw bright headlights behind me. A truck pulled up and parked. I rushed over to it, and a big man wearing a camo jacket got out. He asked if I needed help, but before I could answer, he saw the man with the stick coming toward my car. I quickly told him that the guy had been trying to break in. The man from the truck didn't hesitate. He reached under his seat, pulled out a gun, and yelled at the shirtless guy to back off. As soon as the man saw the gun, he dropped the stick and raised his hands in the air. The guy from the truck handed me his phone and told me to call the police. Thankfully, he had service. We waited there until the cops arrived. They took the shirtless guy away, and I got my car towed. I spent the night at a nearby hotel and got my car fixed the next day. As soon as I got to my new place, I sold that car. That night was one of the scariest experiences of my life. A couple of years ago, I was driving to pick up my girlfriend from her job. Her car was in the shop, so I offered to drive her home after her late shift, which ended around 11 p.m. It was about a 20-minute drive to get there, and after she got in my car, we started heading back. The roads were super quiet since it was so late. About halfway home, my car, an older one that had been acting up, suddenly broke down. I tried restarting it several times, but nothing worked. It was just us, stuck on the side of a dark and empty road. A few cars passed by in the first 5 minutes, but we didn't know anyone nearby to call for help. So we decided to call roadside assistance. but they told us it would be a 45-minute wait. Not ideal, but at least help was on the way. We were on a quiet stretch of road, surrounded by wilderness. It was pitch black, and the only light came from our phones and the occasional car passing by. We were just talking and scrolling through our phones, trying to pass the time, when we saw headlights approaching from behind. We didn't think much of it until we noticed the car was moving really slowly. It turned out to be an old, creepy-looking white van from the 80s. I made a joke about it to my girlfriend, but I couldn't help wondering why it was driving so slowly. The van passed us and disappeared around the corner. A few minutes later, we saw headlights again. Sure enough, it was the same white van, moving just as slowly as before. I made another comment about it, feeling a little uneasy, but it passed us and vanished again. Then, after a couple of minutes, we saw the same van for the third time. This time, it was going even slower. I tried to lighten the mood by joking that it was AAA finally showing up, but I was getting really nervous. As the van passed us once more, it started pulling over to the side of the road, about 40 feet in front of us. It just sat there and nobody got out. I was freaking out inside. I tried starting my car again, desperate to get out of there, but nothing happened. The van stayed there for what felt like forever, and then the driver's door finally opened. A man stepped out but didn't come toward us right away. Instead, he walked around to the passenger side of the van and stood there, almost hiding. I could barely see him. After a couple of minutes, he started walking toward us. My heart was pounding, and I had no idea what to do. I was scared out of my mind. Then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights from another car coming up behind us. Without even thinking, I jumped out of my car and stood in the middle of the road, waving my arms to get the driver to stop. As the car slowed down, I heard a noise behind me and turned to see the man getting back into his van. He quickly drove off after that. The car that had slowed down drove past us, probably thinking I was crazy, but at least the creepy van was gone. My girlfriend and I sat in the car, nervous that the van might come back, but thankfully it didn't. A few more cars passed, and eventually, the roadside assistance arrived and towed my car. I still think about that night and wonder what the guy in the van was planning to do. Back when I was in college, I worked at a shoe store in a strip mall during the summers while staying at my parents' house. One night, I was closing up the store by myself since I had been there for a while, and they trusted me. We closed at 10 p.m., and after finishing everything, I headed out to the parking lot. It was almost empty by then, and my car was parked far away because the lot had been busy when I got there. I got into my car, but when I tried to start it, it wouldn't start. The engine made a weird sound, but it wouldn't turn over. I didn't know much about cars, so I called my dad to tell him what was going on. He said he'd be there in about 30 minutes to check it out, so I sat in the car and waited. The parking lot was completely quiet, with only a few cars parked far away. I passed the time scrolling through my phone. After a few minutes, I looked up and saw a man walking through the parking lot. He was wearing a hood and kept his head down. At first, it seemed like he was coming towards my car, but then he changed direction and wandered around for a bit before disappearing behind the building. He seemed a little off, like he didn't have anywhere specific to go, and the way he glanced at my car made me nervous. A few minutes passed, and I realized I really had to use the restroom. There was a gas station nearby, so I decided to walk there, even though I was a little worried about that guy. But he'd been gone for a while, so I figured it was fine. The walk took about 10 minutes, and I didn't see anyone along the way. I quickly used the restroom and headed back. When I got close to the store, I saw my car still sitting in the parking lot, but I also saw the same guy. He was standing next to my car, trying to open the door and hitting the window. I froze for a second, watching from a distance, but then he noticed me. He stopped what he was doing and started walking toward me. I panicked and backed away, going around the building to try to lose him. But he kept following me. I made a full lap around the building, and when I came around the front again, I saw my dad pulling into the parking lot in his truck. I started running toward him, but the guy started running after me. He was fast, and I knew I wouldn't make it to the passenger seat in time. So instead, I jumped into the back of my dad's truck just as the guy reached us. Luckily, my dad knew something was wrong and hit the gas. The man tried to grab the truck, but we were already speeding away. He chased us for a few moments, but we were too fast, and he couldn't keep up. Once we were a safe distance away, my dad pulled over, and I climbed into the passenger seat. We called the cops and headed back to the parking lot, but the man was gone. When we checked my car, there were dents all over it. He must have kicked or hit it with something. I was really angry about the damage, but the car was old anyway, and I ended up getting a new one not long after that. When I was 19, I had a job where I worked really late nights. I don't work there anymore, but I miss it sometimes because it was fun, except for one scary night. It was a Thursday, and I got off work around midnight. The drive home usually took about 15 minutes. I lived with my parents at the time, so I was headed there. A few minutes into my drive on a quiet road, my car started smoking. I pulled over, not knowing what was wrong, and turned the car off. Almost right after I stopped, a pickup truck pulled over behind me. I figured the driver must have seen the smoke and wanted to help. A man got out of the truck and walked toward me. He was a bigger guy, probably a bit older than me. I got out of my car and said hi, and he seemed friendly right away. He asked if I was okay and what happened with my car. I told him I didn't know, and he said I couldn't drive it like that. Then he offered to give me a ride to my parents' house. Looking back, I know it was a dumb decision, but he seemed nice, and I didn't think anything bad would happen. So I got into his truck. He kept chatting, asking where I worked, and other small talk. I told him my address, and he said he knew where it was. But after about 10 minutes, I noticed he missed the turn. When I pointed it out, he said, "Oh, I just need to make a quick stop. You don't mind, right?" That's when I started feeling uneasy. It was after midnight, and we were driving through the middle of nowhere. What kind of stop could he need to make at this hour? I pulled out my phone to call my parents, but when I did, he asked, "What are you doing?" I said I was going to text my mom, but he cut me off and asked what kind of phone I had. I told him it was an iPhone, and he asked to see it. When I held it up, he grabbed it from my hand and threw it out the window. I was in shock and asked him what he was doing, but he didn't answer. That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. We drove in silence for a while down random, dark country roads. Eventually, he stopped at the end of a long driveway that led into the woods. He got out of the truck and told me to get out too. I was terrified. He came around to my side and grabbed my arm, trying to lead me up the driveway. I didn't think I could fight him. He was much bigger than me. But as we started walking, I kicked him as hard as I could in the groin. He let go and fell to the ground, and I took off running. I didn't stop, even though I had no idea where I was. I ran through the woods until I came out onto another quiet road. Just when I thought I was out of options, I saw headlights. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms like crazy. Thankfully, the car that pulled up was a police car. I felt instant relief. The officer stopped, and I told him what happened. He called for backup, and when we went back to the driveway where the man's truck was, he was gone. The police took me home and asked me more questions. Eventually, they found the guy who had picked me up. It was the scariest experience of my life. A couple of years ago, one morning, I was getting ready to leave for work. I had a typical office job and lived in a house just outside the city. I went out to my car in my detached garage, but when I tried to start it, nothing happened. This was weird because my car had been working fine up until then, and it wasn't that old. It had even run well the day before. Since I didn't have time to figure out what was wrong, I called a Lyft to get to work. Thankfully, I lived close enough to the city that it wasn't hard to find one, and I made it to work on time. The rest of the day was pretty normal. After work, I took another Lyft home, and when I got back, I decided to check on my car and see what was going on. I went out to the garage, popped the hood, and looked at the engine. Even though I'm not a mechanic, I could tell something was wrong. Someone had tampered with it. I had no idea who would do that or why. I was standing there, frustrated, trying to figure it all out, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Down beneath some shelves in the garage, I saw a man hiding, watching me. As soon as he realized I saw him, he started moving. My only instinct was to get away. He stood up, and I saw he was holding a hammer. That's when I knew I had to run. I bolted out of the garage and ran around to my house, locking the door behind me. The man reached the door seconds later and tried to open it. When he realized it was locked, he started banging on the window with the hammer. I grabbed my phone and called 911, telling them what was happening. I ran to the back of the house, trying to stay as far away from the front as possible. It wasn't long before I heard glass shattering. The man had broken a window. I could hear him making a lot of noise at the front door, and soon after, I knew he was inside the house. At that point, I slipped out the back door, running into my backyard and through my neighbor's yard, making my way to the street. I just wanted to get as far away from him as I could. I didn't hear or see him anymore. While talking to the police on the phone, I kept walking around the street, keeping an eye out for him. After about 10 minutes, the police finally arrived. I went back and met them, and they entered my house through the open front door. I stayed outside with other officers while they checked the place. After a few minutes, they came out with the man in handcuffs. He was arrested right there. I think he must have been on drugs or something because he seemed completely out of it. When I went back inside, I saw that he had smashed up a lot of things. It looked like he had taken the hammer to almost everything. Thankfully, I had insurance, so I didn't have to pay too much for the repairs, but it still took a while to fix everything. I'm just glad he didn't hurt me. I still don't know how he got into my garage or how long he had been hiding there. It's scary to think he might have been there when I tried to start my car that morning. This happened when I was 16 years old, just after I got my first job at a restaurant. My parents let me use their old car, which wasn't in great shape. It had broken down once before, but we managed to get it running again, and for a few weeks, it worked fine. I used it to drive to school and work. One night, after working late, I started driving home. It usually took about 15 minutes, and we lived in a rural area, so the roads were quiet with just woods on both sides. Out of nowhere, the car began losing power and eventually died. I pulled over to the side of the road and tried starting it again, but nothing happened. It was the same issue as before when it broke down. I took out my phone to call my parents, but realized it was dead, and since the car had no power, I couldn't charge it. I didn't know what to do. There were no businesses nearby, just some private properties. But it was late, and I didn't think it was a good idea to go knock on anyone's door. I hoped my parents would realize I hadn't made it home and come looking for me, since they knew the car could break down. Sitting there, it started to feel a little spooky. The woods were dark and quiet, except for the sound of crickets, the occasional owl, and the wind in the trees. I didn't want to get out of the car. After about 10 minutes, while I was looking around, I saw something that made my heart race. A man standing in the woods, half hidden behind a tree. He had a beard, and he was just standing there, watching me. I was so creeped out. I had no idea what to do, and I couldn't understand why someone would be out there in the woods at this hour. He stood there for over a minute, just staring at me. Then he disappeared back into the trees. Even though he was gone, I was still scared. I kept looking around, expecting him to come back. After about 10 more minutes, just as I started to feel a bit calmer, I looked again, and there he was. This time, he was walking toward me. My heart was pounding as I watched him come all the way to the edge of the road, less than 10 feet from my car. The man walked over to the passenger side and tried to open the door. Then he calmly walked around to the driver's side and tried that door too. I was terrified. I ducked down, covered my face with my hands, and didn't want to look. He kept poking around the car, trying all the doors. At one point, he knocked on one of the windows, and then he started banging on my driver's side window. When I finally looked up, I saw his face staring right at me. It was the most scared I had ever been. I didn't know what he was going to do, and although my car was locked, I was afraid he might break in. After a few moments of banging on the window, the man stopped and walked to the other side of the car again. Just then, I saw headlights approaching from behind. I felt a bit of relief. As the car got closer, I heard it honking repeatedly, and then I realized it was my parents. The man saw the car and ran back into the woods. My parents pulled over behind me, and I got out and ran to them. I was so relieved to be safe. Once I got in their car, I explained what happened. They called the police and reported the man. We stayed there until the police arrived, but the man didn't come back. The officers searched the woods but couldn't find him. We also arranged for a tow truck to get my car. Even now, it creeps me out that the man got away. I still don't know where he came from or what he was doing out there, but I'm just glad I'm okay. Last year, I decided to go on a road trip to visit a couple of friends from high school who had moved to Berkeley to study at the University of California. Visiting them had become a summer tradition for me, and we were as close as brothers. Normally I'd fly, but last year I chose to drive so I could check out some parks, museums, and landmarks along the way. The first 2 days of the trip went fine. Everything was smooth. By the third day, I expected to arrive at my friend's place, but I was still driving late into the night. It must have been around 9 or 10 p.m. by then, and the roads were eerily quiet. Hardly any cars in sight, which felt both peaceful and a bit unsettling, as I've always had a small fear of empty roads. I still had a few hours to go and was eager to get to my destination. Needing a bathroom break and some coffee to stay awake, I pulled over at a small rest stop I spotted. It wasn't like the big rest stops with gas stations and truck parking. This one was just a small building with a few parking spots, perfect for a quick stop. As I parked, I noticed it was dark and no one else was around. After stretching a bit, I went inside, where I saw a hallway with a men's restroom on one side, a women's restroom on the other, and some vending machines. I was getting an energy drink from one of the machines when I noticed another car pull in and park right next to mine, even though there were plenty of open spaces. That felt a bit weird, but I shrugged it off and headed to the restroom. After a few minutes, I came back out and saw the car was still next to mine, with the headlights on, meaning the driver was still inside. Something didn't feel right, but I tried to ignore it. As I drank my Red Bull and headed towards the exit, I heard the car's engine shut off. The driver's door opened, and a tall man with a beard and a brown leather jacket stepped out. He started walking towards me, hands in his pockets, staring at me with this unsettling look. My whole body tensed up and I tried to stay calm, but I was on edge. As we passed each other, I nodded and he nodded back. But after a few steps, I heard him call out, "Hey!" I turned around to see him pointing a gun at me, a 9mm pistol aimed right at my face. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked with a creepy smile. I was terrified. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm, raising my hands to show I wasn't resisting. "What do you want?" I asked. "Your watch, wallet, and phone," he said. I handed them over without hesitation, hoping it would end there. But then he motioned for me to follow him, leading me into the woods behind the building. I was panicking inside. If all he wanted was to rob me, why was he taking me into the woods? This had to be something worse. As we walked deeper into the trees, I begged him to let me go, even offering him my car. He stayed silent. After about 20 meters, he stopped and told me to turn around. I did as he said, facing him, and we were now just a few feet apart. He raised the gun, pointing it directly at my face. At that moment, I thought I was going to die. Tears streamed down my face, and my body was shaking. I closed my eyes, waiting for the shot. Then out of nowhere, bang, bang, bang! 3 gunshots rang out. I screamed and hit the ground, covering my ears. I thought I'd been shot, but I felt no pain. When I opened my eyes, I realized he hadn't shot me at all. Instead, he was standing there laughing, like it was all some kind of sick joke. "Go home, kid, and don't forget to wash your pants," he said, still laughing as he walked away. I lay there for a while, completely stunned and humiliated. Eventually, I gathered myself, went back to the building to wash my face, and got into my car. Shaken and exhausted, I drove to the nearest town, where I borrowed a phone to call the police and reported everything. I rented a room for the night, but I was still too rattled to sleep. The next day, I finally made it to my friend's house and told them everything. They couldn't believe how close I came to dying. Even though I spent a couple of weeks with them, I was still shaken up. That night haunted me for months, And to this day, I can't shake the feeling of how lucky I was to get out of that situation alive. Since then, I've never stopped at a rest stop again. My name's Dan, and I've been a truck driver for over 25 years. 4 years ago, something happened to me that I'll never forget. It changed my life. It was a rainy night, and I was driving my truck down the highway. The road was completely empty. It was about 4 a.m., and I still had 4 hours to go before reaching the company's warehouse to deliver some industrial supplies. Out of nowhere, a heavy downpour began, making it tough to see the road. But after so many years on the job, I was used to driving in bad weather. The rain didn't worry me as much as the strange feeling that started to creep in. It's hard to explain, but something didn't feel right. Maybe it was the eerie silence or how long I'd been driving without a break. Either way, I just couldn't shake the feeling. I turned on some music to distract myself and kept driving carefully, slowing down to make sure I had control. The rain was pouring hard and the fog was getting thicker. Suddenly, through the fog, I saw the headlights of a car speeding toward me from the opposite direction. I didn't see it until it was almost right on top of me. I swerved to avoid a crash, but the wet road made me lose control. Before I knew it, my truck flipped and went off the road. I felt weightless for a second before everything went black. The sound of metal crunching was the last thing I remember. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground in the rain. My head was pounding and I couldn't move. I realized I was badly hurt. I couldn't feel my legs. I tried calling out, but my voice was too weak. I thought I was going to die there, alone in the middle of nowhere. After what felt like forever, I heard footsteps and an engine. An older man and his son found me. They called for help and stayed with me until the ambulance came. I was in and out of consciousness, but I remember the doctors saying I had broken bones, internal bleeding, and a serious head injury. They said I was lucky to be alive. The recovery was tough, so tough that there were moments I wished I hadn't survived. Weeks passed while I lay in the hospital, unable to move. I felt helpless. Then, something strange started happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching me. At first, I thought it was just the trauma from the accident, but it kept happening. One night, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and dark, and I couldn't see any details. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I was frozen with fear. The figure moved closer until I could feel its cold breath on my face. I shut my eyes, praying it would go away. When I finally opened them, it was gone. The next morning I told the nurses, but they brushed it off as sleep paralysis. But I knew what I saw. Over the next few days, the figure kept showing up. It never stopped being terrifying, but I stopped telling people about it, not wanting to sound crazy. I started thinking that maybe this figure had something to do with the accident. I did some research and found out that other drivers who had crashed on that same stretch of highway reported similar things, seeing headlights coming at them or a shadowy figure in the road. I reached out to William, the man who found me after the accident. When I asked him about that night, he said something that sent chills down my spine. He hadn't seen any other car that night. He was driving behind me when he saw my truck swerve off the road, but there was no car coming the other way. There was no car until the ambulance arrived. That's when I realized the figure I kept seeing might have caused my accident, just like it had for other drivers. But the strangest part came later. One night the figure appeared again, but this time it whispered to me. It told me its story. It was a truck driver who had died on that same highway many years ago. He had been driving in a storm when a car came at him from the other direction. He couldn't avoid the crash, and both drivers died. I was about to ask the figure more when a nurse walked in and it vanished. That was the last time I saw it. The next day, I found a news report from 35 years ago about a fatal accident on that highway. A drunk driver had been going the wrong way and hit a truck head-on, killing both drivers instantly. I realized the figure wasn't the truck driver. It was the driver of the other car. Since then, I've prayed for both of them, hoping their souls can finally rest in peace. It was August 2008, one of the hottest summers I can remember. I was driving my old cargo truck, hauling steel sheets to a construction site in southern Missouri. I had over 20 years of truck driving experience and thought I had seen it all. But what happened that day still haunts me. I was cruising down Highway 60, going through Mark Twain National Forest. It's a beautiful place during the day, but pretty creepy at night. I planned to stop at a truck stop near Springfield for a bathroom break and maybe some food before continuing my drive. A few miles before I reached the stop, I noticed an old beat-up truck on the side of the road. The hood was propped open, and as I got closer, I saw a chubby man waving his arms at me. We truck drivers have a code. We help each other out. So I slowed down, parked a bit ahead, and walked over to see if I could help. The man, about 45 years old, wore a dirty baseball flannel shirt. It was clear he had been working on his truck for hours. The sun was starting to set, and he looked relieved when I approached. "Thank God you stopped," he said, shaking my hand. He introduced himself as Neil and explained he had been stuck there for 4 or 5 hours. His truck's alternator was broken, and he asked if I could give him a ride to the nearest town to find a mechanic. He seemed harmless, and I didn't want to leave him stranded, so I told him to grab his duffel bag and hop in. As we drove, Neil was quite the talker. He told me he was from Alabama and on his way to pick up a load in St. Louis. He admitted his truck had been having problems for weeks, but he thought it would hold up. About 15 or 20 minutes into our drive, I noticed 2 cars in my rearview mirror. They were closely following each other. At first, I thought nothing of it, but they didn't try to pass us, which felt strange since we were the only ones on the road. I asked Neil if he knew them, but he didn't recognize them either. I joked if he was running from someone, and although he laughed, I could see he was getting anxious. Those cars followed us for about 10 miles without attempting to pass. It felt suspicious. Then, as we reached a stretch of road lined with woods, the cars suddenly sped up, overtook us, and blocked the road. I slammed on the brakes, thinking, "What the hell?" As they came to a stop in front of us, 3 men stepped out, all armed, and headed straight for my truck. My heart raced as I noticed Neil go pale and start sweating. I whispered for him to stay calm and instinctively reached under my seat for my gun, only to remember I had left it at home. My company had recently cracked down on carrying firearms, so I didn't have it on this trip. The men positioned themselves at both doors, guns drawn. One of them shouted for us to get out of the truck. I raised my hands, trying to stay calm. "You can take whatever you want," I said, but the man shouted again for us to get out. We slowly complied, and as Neil climbed out, he stumbled and nearly fell. The men ordered us to the side of the road and told us to empty our pockets. We handed over our wallets, phones, and keys. "You can take the truck. Just let us go," I pleaded, but the man snapped at me to shut up. After taking our belongings, he threw my truck keys back at me and told me to start the engine. Confused, I looked at Neil, who seemed just as bewildered. Then the man ordered me back into the truck, while one of the others told Neil to get into one of their cars. I didn't know what they were planning, but with guns pointed at us, I had no choice. I started the truck and we drove again, with one car in front carrying Neil and the other following behind. We left the highway and took a narrow dirt road deeper into the woods. I racked my brain for a way out, but there wasn't one. Even if I escaped, I couldn't leave Neil behind. The trees closed in as we drove further into the woods until we reached a small clearing. Both cars stopped and the men got out, still holding their guns. They ordered me out of the truck and my hands shook as I complied. Dread filled me. If they brought us this far, it couldn't be for anything good. The leader signaled for me to follow him into the woods, where Neil was being led by a short, stocky guy with a devilish grin. He flashed me a sinister smile as we continued walking until we reached an old, abandoned cabin. Fear twisted my stomach as they shoved us inside. The place was filthy, filled with garbage and old furniture. They ordered us to sit on a dusty couch. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to sound steady. The stocky guy smiled again and said in a low voice, "Just make sure you don't go running to the police." His companions chuckled as they tied our hands and feet, making jokes the whole time, and then they left, slamming the door behind them. As soon as they were gone, I started struggling to loosen the ropes, telling Neil we had to get out of there. He looked pale and shaky, whispering, "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" I tried to sound confident, though fear gripped me too. "Not if we get out first," I said, working furiously to free my wrists. Finally, I managed to loosen the knots and untie Neil. "Thanks, buddy," he muttered, trying to keep things light. I replied, "Save it for when we're actually safe." We stumbled out of the cabin into the dark woods. The cars and my truck were gone, but we had no choice but to head in the opposite direction of the cabin, hoping to find the road. We eventually made it to the road, terrified the men might come back, but we couldn't stay in the woods. We stuck to the roadside, ready to dive into the trees at the first sign of danger. After what felt like hours, we heard a car approaching. We hid in the brush, praying it wasn't them. Thankfully, it was an older man in an old sedan. We waved him down, desperate for help. After briefly explaining the situation, he agreed to take us to the nearest sheriff's office. Exhausted but relieved, the man, Jeff, drove us to a small town called Ellington and dropped us off at the sheriff's office. We gave our statements about the three men and everything that happened. The sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Stewart, took us seriously. He sent out a patrol to search for my truck and promised they would catch those men. "You two are lucky to be alive," he said. Neil and I exchanged a look. We were alive, but it had been a close call. A few hours later, the deputies found my truck abandoned in the woods, but there was no sign of the men. We thanked the sheriff and got back on the road, still shaken. I never saw Neil again after that night, although we exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. I think about him every time I pass through southern Missouri. That experience changed me. It made me more cautious and aware of the dangers on the road. I still help people when I can, but I'm always on guard now, ready for anything. Every time I drive down a dark, lonely stretch of highway, I wonder if those men ever got caught or if they're still out there looking for their next target. But life goes on, and so do I. There's always another load to haul and another destination to reach. As long as I'm behind the wheel, I'll keep moving forward, no matter what the road throws my way. A truck driver is always on the move, always looking ahead to the next route. One night, I had a scary experience that I still remember clearly. Back then, I worked nights at an old ranch in Arizona that had been turned into a hotel. It was an easy job, but the hour-and-a-half drive home each night was tiring. At first, it took away my free time, but I got used to it over time. One night, I stopped at a taco truck about halfway home because I was starving and couldn't wait to eat. The truck was parked outside an RV park, and I had seen it a few times over the past 2 months, but had never stopped. This night, my stomach growled, so I pulled off the road and walked to the truck. To my surprise, the tacos were some of the best I'd ever had. I ordered them to go and ate in my car, feeling like I had found a hidden gem. The next night, I stopped there again, and it quickly became part of my routine. I enjoyed my tacos, tried the different salsas, and finished with a soda and a cigarette. The taco guy even had lemon-scented hand wipes, which he always gave me. I must have visited him 40 or 50 times, but I never learned his name. It felt awkward to ask after so long, and he never asked for mine. One night, I parked in my usual spot and walked to the taco truck, but something felt off. For the first time, the taco guy wasn't there, and there were no customers around. I thought maybe he was just out of sight, so I called out to him, but no one answered. The silence was eerie, and I started to smell something burning. I tried to look over the counter to see if something was cooking, but I couldn't see anything. I felt worried. If something was burning, it could cause a fire. I didn't want him to lose his truck or his livelihood, so I decided to step in and turn off the grill. I walked around to the side of the truck, climbed the stairs, and opened the door. Inside, I saw the cash register open with coins scattered everywhere. At first, I thought maybe he had been robbed, but there were no signs of a struggle. Then, I looked at the grill and my heart stopped. There, I saw a charred outline of a hand, completely burned. I stumbled back down the stairs but managed to stay on my feet. Trying to stay calm, I opened the compartment under the grill and shut off the gas. Without looking back, I closed the door and walked to my car to call the police. When I called 911, I struggled to explain the situation. I knew someone had been hurt, but I didn't even know the taco guy's name. The operator asked me questions, and I did my best to answer. They said officers would be on their way. I waited for about 30 or 40 minutes, but no one came. I sat there for nearly an hour, feeling numb and confused about what had happened. I couldn't understand why the police hadn't shown up right away. I regretted not learning the taco guy's name. If I had, maybe I could have helped track him down. In the days that followed, I searched online for news about a taco truck owner who had been burned in a robbery, but I found nothing. The taco truck never returned, and I never saw the taco guy again. To this day, I just hope he's okay. For years, my best friend Victoria and I had been planning this trip, and it was finally time. We were on our mid-semester break, and we really needed to get away from the stress of college, especially since we were in our senior year and the work had been tough lately. Like me, Victoria was an only child, which made us bond even more. We had been close friends for about 4 years, and I couldn't imagine my college experience without her. Outside our dorm, we said goodbye to everyone as we got ready to head home for the break. We had already told our parents we'd be spending this time together, and with our bags packed, it was finally time to get into the car and hit the road. I was driving because it was my car, my prized possession, which my parents gave me for my 20th birthday. Victoria entered the address into the GPS, and we were ready to go. The journey would take about 6 hours to reach the resort where we had booked our stay. The trip started off smoothly, with Victoria and me chatting about our classes and gossiping about classmates and professors. I really enjoyed being with Victoria, and I felt grateful for our friendship. However, about 3 hours into our drive, the gas light flickered on. I decided to stop at the nearest gas station, which was about 15 minutes away. When we arrived, I hurried to refuel because I didn't want to take too long. As I reached for the nozzle, I suddenly heard a scream behind me. I turned around and saw a man with a gun yelling at me to get on the ground. He had a scar on his face and tattoos all over, making him look really scary. Another man was standing by the entrance, and he also pulled out a gun. I looked at Victoria, who was frozen in fear. I glanced at the other cars at the pumps, hoping to find someone who could help us, but they were all empty. I couldn't believe it. This gas station seemed like a trap for unsuspecting travelers like us, far away from the city. The man yelled that if we didn't get on the ground, he would shoot us and do terrible things to us. His threats were terrifying, and I was scared. I dropped the nozzle and shouted at Victoria to comply, but she seemed to be in shock. I could see her breathing rapidly, her eyes wide with fear. I knew she often panicked in situations like this, and I became really worried about her. The leader grew impatient, demanding we get on the ground. I pleaded, "Please, let me get my friend out." Holding my breath, I hoped he would agree. He gestured for me to continue, so I quickly jumped into the car, shaking Victoria to get her attention. Finally, her eyes met mine, showing her sheer terror. I urged her to breathe and focus. Instead of pulling her out, I started the car and pressed the gas pedal, taking off from the gas station without thinking. I heard the man cursing behind us, and then I heard their car's engine start. I didn't know how I managed everything so quickly, but as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw they were following us. They probably didn't expect me to take a chance and flee. Now we were being chased, and I prayed I hadn't made a terrible mistake. "It's going to be okay," I reassured Victoria, and she silently nodded. Just then, something metallic hit the car, and I lost control of the steering wheel for a moment. The car began swerving back and forth. I yelled at Victoria while trying to duck down, realizing they were shooting at us. The guy in the passenger seat leaned out of the car, aiming his weapon at us. I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was shaking with fear. We didn't want to die, especially not like this. We were too young for that, but it felt like a real possibility as their car got closer. I kept my head down and tried to speed up, but they were ramming into the back of our car, trying to force me off the road. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling a mix of fear and anger. Victoria was crying and shaking beside me. Another bullet hit the side of the car, and I cursed the emptiness of the road since we hadn't seen another vehicle since we left. Suddenly, an idea popped into my head, and I hoped it would work. I waited for them to ram us again, watching their movements. When I saw their car speed up, I slammed on the brakes and swerved to the side. They sped past us, and as soon as they did, I hit the gas and sharply turned the car into their direction, sideswiping them. The impact caused their driver to lose control, and everything happened in a blur. Their car spun off the road and overturned, flipping and shattering as it crashed. I didn't care if they survived. I just wanted to escape. I pressed down on the gas and sped away, leaving them far behind. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as I focused on calming down. I pulled over a bit later to check the car. They had fired several shots, but luckily only 2 had hit the car, and neither was serious. We were okay. After making sure everything was fine, I resumed driving. Thankfully, we made it to our destination without needing to stop at another gas station. When we finally arrived at the resort, we were shaken, but ultimately safe. The whole incident had put a damper on our spirits, but we promised to try to enjoy the trip. This would be a road trip we would never forget. In 2016, my family and I decided to leave our old apartment in Mississippi. My parents often said life was easier there. They never really liked living in the city, and as they got older, they wanted the peace and quiet of country life. Airfare was high at that time, and we didn't have much extra money, so my parents chose to drive instead. It was a long journey, about 13 hours, but we had taken many road trips over the years, so we were ready for it. We packed our bags and hit the road. The trip was going fine until we were halfway there. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the car slowing down. I asked my dad why we stopped, and then I saw a person lying in the middle of the road. It looked like a woman, maybe in her 50s, with light brown hair and a sweater. My parents were anxious. My dad, being a former Marine, got out to help. Mom and I stayed in the car watching. But when my dad got closer, he quickly backed away and jumped back in the car. His face was full of shock. He sped away, and I caught a glimpse of what scared him. The woman's face looked unsettling. Her eyes were wide open, and her jaw was oddly positioned. There was some blood around her nose, and she had bruises. It was a shocking sight. Next to her, there was a blue star spray painted on the road, but we didn't know what it meant. My family wondered if it was a sign of some dangerous group or even a cult. It sounded far-fetched, but I understood why we thought that. After 4 more hours, we arrived in the next town. Thankfully, my dad was able to file a police report. We couldn't remember exactly where we saw the woman, just that it was on a lonely road. I hoped the police would look into it. 3 months later, while I was in Walmart, I found a magazine about disappearances. I loved mysteries, so I started flipping through it. As I looked at the photos, one caught my eye. It had the same blue star from that night. This time, it showed a body at the base of a tree with the blue star spray painted on the trunk. The title said something about finding the symbol while hiking. The comments were wild. Some people thought it was linked to a cult called the Smiley Face Killers, while others suspected it was a drug cartel fight. There were even theories about aliens, but the most serious suggestion was that a group of assassins, called the Star Killers, was behind it all. In the end, no one really knows who did it. All we have are these scary theories, and there still hasn't been an official report about those terrible crimes. A few years ago, I was driving home on a quiet road at night. I had just made a turn and was about 15 minutes away from home when my car started slowing down and making strange noises. I was confused because my car had always run well. Then I realized I had run out of gas. The warning light had come on earlier, but I forgot about it. My car came to a complete stop, and I felt really foolish for being so careless. I thought about calling a friend for help, but when I took out my phone, I saw I had no signal. I wasn't surprised, but I kept trying for about 20 minutes, and nothing worked. It was late, so even if my phone had worked, my friends were probably asleep. I knew there was a gas station about a mile away, and it would take me about 30 minutes to walk there. The weather was nice, so I decided to walk and get some gas. It wasn't a big deal. I got out of my car and found a small empty gas container in the back, which I usually kept for my mower. I took it and started walking along the roadside. It was really quiet, and I didn't see any cars pass by. There wasn't even a sidewalk, so I walked on the grass a few feet from the road. Dense forest lined both sides. As I walked, I noticed the headlights of a pickup truck slowing down as it approached my car. I thought they might be stopping to help, so I considered asking for a ride to the gas station. But then I saw two men get out, one from the passenger side and another from the driver's side. They pulled ski masks over their faces and walked toward my car. Fear gripped me, and I froze, hoping they wouldn't see me. I was pretty sure they thought I was still inside my car. I quickly backed into the woods to get a better look. I watched as they rummaged through my car, peering into the windows and using a phone as a flashlight. One of them knocked on the window, trying to see if anyone was inside, and they tried opening the doors, which I had locked. Then they started looking around, seemingly searching for me. When they glanced in my direction, I did my best to hide, but I think they noticed me anyway. One of the men walked toward the woods while the other went back to the truck. Seeing this, I turned around and tried to sneak deeper into the trees to keep moving toward the gas station. But then I heard footsteps running toward me. When I looked back, the first guy was sprinting to the truck. They climbed in and started driving toward my direction. I had no choice but to dive into the woods and run as fast as I could. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran, terrified of what they might do. The forest was full of trees and branches, and I kept tripping. I could hear the guy behind me getting closer, so I just kept going, even though I had no idea where the edge of the forest was. After what felt like several minutes, I finally broke free from the trees and spotted a house with a big yard. I ran toward it, hoping to call for help. I realized I didn't hear the guy behind me anymore, so I ran around the back of the house, held my breath, and thought about what to do next. I didn't want to knock on the front door and scare anyone unless I had to. I waited a few minutes, and seeing no sign of the men in the truck, I decided to go back to the road. It was a long trek, but eventually, I made it back to the road I had been on, staying alert for any sign of the truck. Thankfully, it was nowhere in sight. I continued walking to the gas station, staying close to the edge of the woods so I could hide quickly if I saw the truck coming. A little while later, I heard a car coming, so I jumped into the woods and hid, trying to blend in with the bushes. I couldn't tell if it was the truck, so I didn't want to take any chances. Finally, I made it to the gas station, filled my container as quickly as I could, and then walked back to my car. I filled my tank in record time and drove home at full speed, feeling a huge sense of relief when I parked in my garage. Looking back, I still don't know what those men wanted or who they were, but it didn't seem good. So always remember to keep your gas tank filled and carry an extra container in your car. It could save you from a scary situation on a dark road. I've spent a lot of my life driving long distances for work, covering nearly every major highway in the state. There's something calming about being on the road for hours, watching the scenery change and listening to the hum of the tires. But one night on Highway 22, something happened that still troubles me, and I have questions that no one can answer. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was heading home from a job site in the next town over. Highway 22 goes through a pretty isolated area, with long stretches of road and not much around but fields and woods. There aren't many cars on that route after dark, and that night I hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I drove, I noticed a figure on the side of the road. At first I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man standing at the edge of the highway with his thumb out, like he was trying to hitch a ride. I slowed down instinctively, but something about the way he stood made me hesitate. He was tall and skinny, wearing an old military jacket. His face was partly covered by a wide-brimmed hat, and he stood stiffly, almost unnaturally. What really unsettled me was that he wasn't looking at the road. He was facing the woods, his back turned to the highway. Despite my better judgment, I stopped my car a few feet ahead of him and rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, do you need a ride?" I called out. The man didn't respond or even turn around. The silence felt heavy and wrong. I was about to drive away when he slowly turned to face me. His movements were deliberate, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. When his face came into view, my stomach dropped. His eyes were wide and glassy, unfocused, like he didn't fully know where he was. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his lips were parted, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at me with his thumb still raised, not stepping toward the car. My hand hovered over the gear shift, ready to leave, but there was something in his expression that made me hesitate. It was like he was pleading with me without saying a word. Then, finally he spoke. "Don't go down that road," he said in a low, hoarse voice, like he hadn't spoken in days. "You won't come back." A chill ran through me. I glanced at the empty road ahead. It stretched out dark and still. Confused, I asked, "What are you talking about?" But he just kept staring, his thumb still out, as if he hadn't just spoken at all. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I pulled away, my heart racing, leaving that strange man behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, but I just wanted to get home. A few miles down the highway, the road became even more isolated. The trees on both sides seemed to close in on me, their branches hanging low and casting long shadows across the asphalt. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the air felt heavy and cold. I'd driven this road dozens of times before, but that night it felt different, like I was somewhere else entirely. Suddenly, my car started to sputter. The engine whined and choked, and before I knew it, the car slowed to a crawl and finally stopped in the middle of the road. Stunned, I sat there with my heart pounding as the engine died completely. I tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. The dashboard lights flickered, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was completely alone, stranded on an empty stretch of highway, with no cell service and no idea how far I was from the nearest town. I couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. "You won't come back." I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Cars break down, it happens. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw it in the rearview mirror. A figure stepped out of the woods. It was the same man, the hitchhiker, but something was different. His movements were slow, almost robotic as he walked toward my car. His head was tilted slightly and his arms hung limply at his sides. He didn't look like someone who needed help anymore. He looked like something that was following me. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I fumbled with my keys, trying the ignition again, and to my relief, the car sputtered to life. I floored the gas, speeding down the highway as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I don't know how long I drove after that. Time felt distorted, like I was stuck in a loop. The trees blurred together, the road seemed to stretch on forever, and every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see that man staring back at me. Eventually, I reached the outskirts of the next town, and the heaviness in the air seemed to lift. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had happened. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that my mind had played tricks on me. But when I asked the locals about Highway 22, one older man at the gas station gave me a strange look. "You shouldn't be driving down that road at night," he said quietly. "Not after what happened to those people." "What people?" I asked, my throat dry. "A couple of years back, there was a wreck. A car went off the road into the woods. They never found the driver, just the passenger wandering around in the trees. He'd lost his mind, babbling about how the road doesn't let you leave. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. To this day, I avoid Highway 22. I've told a few people about what happened, but no one believes me. They think I was just tired and imagined it all. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the look on that man's face when he told me not to go down that road. I don't think I was supposed to come back. I've always loved riding my motorcycle. There's a freedom in being on two wheels that you just can't get in a car. The wind in my face and the open road in front of me is the best feeling. But now, every time I ride, especially at night, I can't shake the memory of what happened last summer. I was coming back from a weekend trip in the mountains, taking the long way home to enjoy the ride. It was late, around 1 a.m., when I hit a long stretch of highway through the desert. The road was empty, with only my bike's headlight and a few distant stars lighting the way. I didn't mind riding alone at night. I had done it many times before. About half an hour into the ride, I noticed something in my mirrors. At first, it was just a small speck of light far behind me. I thought it might be another bike or a car, nothing unusual. But as I kept going, I realized the light was getting closer, but not at a normal speed. It stayed back just far enough that I could see it in my mirrors, but I couldn't make out any details. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the light stayed with me, always maintaining the same distance. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a cautious rider keeping a safe distance. But the longer it went on, the more uneasy I felt. I slowed down, giving them a chance to pass, but they didn't. It felt like they were stalking me, watching my every move. I looked at my fuel gauge. I had half a tank left, enough to make it to the next town, but I still felt uneasy. I scanned the horizon for any signs of civilization, but all I saw was the endless desert. Then suddenly the light behind me disappeared. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the rider to be beside me, but there was nothing, just empty highway behind me. I slowed down, confused. Had they turned off? There hadn't been any exits for miles. Maybe they had stopped or pulled off to the side, but there was no sign of them anywhere. I rode in silence for a few minutes, feeling the uneasiness fade. Maybe I had imagined it all, or they decided to turn around. I started to relax, letting the wind clear my head. That's when I heard it, the low rumble of an engine. At first it was so quiet I thought I was imagining it. But as I listened, it grew louder, like someone was creeping up behind me. I glanced in my mirrors again, and my heart skipped a beat. There was the light again, and this time it was much closer. I tightened my grip on the handlebars, my pulse quickening. Whoever was behind me wasn't playing around anymore. They were closing in fast. I sped up, hoping to shake them off, but their engine matched mine, the light growing brighter in my mirrors. They were right behind me now, so close I could almost feel the heat from their engine. I pushed my bike to its limit, but no matter how fast I went, they stayed right on my tail, their headlamp blinding me. I swerved into the left lane, hoping to get some distance, but they followed, moving in perfect sync with me. I thought about stopping or pulling over, but being alone on the side of the road with this person terrified me. Then, without warning, they swerved into the opposite lane and pulled up beside me. I glanced over, my heart racing. The rider was wearing a helmet with a dark visor, so I couldn't see their face. But there was something off about how they were sitting. Their posture was stiff, and their movements were jerky, like they weren't used to riding. They didn't look at me. They just kept their bike steady next to mine, matching my speed exactly. For a few terrifying seconds, we rode side by side, the rumble of our engines the only sound in the night. I felt adrenaline surge through me, telling me to get away. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they swerved back behind me and disappeared again. The road was empty, with no lights, no sound, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I didn't stop riding until I reached the next town. I pulled into a gas station and parked under the bright lights, my hands shaking and my heart still racing from the encounter. I waited there for a long time, half expecting the other rider to pull in behind me, but they never did. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was just a reckless biker trying to scare me for fun, but something about the way they rode felt unnatural. Because of that, I don't ride at night anymore, especially not on empty highways. I've never really believed in supernatural stuff or wild conspiracy theories. But what happened to me last year on Route 67 still makes me question everything. Months have gone by, and I've thought about it over and over, but I can't figure out what happened that night. I was driving home from a work trip, and I was really tired. By the time I left my last meeting, it was past 10 p.m. I knew the drive would take a few hours, so I decided to take Route 67, a quieter back road that goes through some small towns and farmland. I had driven that way many times before, but always during the day. At night, it felt completely different, pitch black with only a few streetlights and the glow of farmhouses far away. To stay awake, I turned on the radio and flipped through the stations. Most of them were static since I was in the middle of nowhere. I could only find country music or old talk shows. After driving for about an hour, something strange happened. As I was scanning through stations, the static suddenly stopped. A man's voice came through loud and clear, but it wasn't music or a commercial. He was reading something that sounded odd. At 2:07 a.m., the car will break down. Do not get out. Do not respond. I froze, my hand still on the dial. The voice continued. You are being watched. Stay inside the vehicle. It was calm and steady, almost robotic. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. I thought it was just a prank or a creepy radio show trying to scare late-night drivers. But the tone of the voice unsettled me. It felt too personal. Then the voice said something that chilled me. Route 67 is not safe. Do not stop. Do not turn back. My heart raced. I changed the station, hoping to hear something else, but all I got was static. I flipped back, and the man's voice was still there. At 2:07 a.m., do not open the door. My hands were sweating. I turned off the radio, hoping the silence would help. But the darkness outside felt heavy, and the road seemed endless. I tried to focus on driving, but something felt really wrong. For the next hour, I kept checking the clock. Why was that time so important? I told myself I was just overthinking it. But as 2 a.m. approached, the tension in my chest grew. Then, right at 2:07 a.m., my car sputtered, and the engine made a loud choking noise. My stomach dropped. I pressed the gas, but the car slowed down until it stopped in the middle of the highway. My heart pounded as I sat in stunned silence, staring at the dark road ahead. The words from the radio echoed in my mind. Do not get out. Do not respond. I tried restarting the car, but nothing happened. My headlights dimmed, leaving me in almost total darkness. I checked my phone, but I had no signal, and there were no other cars on the road. I wanted to check the engine, but those words kept playing in my head. I locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The highway was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the cooling engine. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. At first, I felt relief. Maybe another car could help me. But as the car got closer, I noticed it was swerving slightly, like the driver wasn't in control. The vehicle slowed down and came to a stop about 50 feet away. I squinted through the darkness, but I couldn't see the driver. The windows were too dark. Suddenly, the radio turned back on by itself. The man's voice came through again. Do not get out of the car. I didn't move. I could feel my heart racing as I watched the car idling softly. I knew whoever was in that car wasn't there to help me. Then the other car's door opened. A figure stepped out, tall and slim, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see their face, but the way they moved slowly sent a chill down my spine. They stood there for a moment, staring at my car, then took a step toward me. I locked the doors, my heart racing as the man's words blared in my mind. Do not open the door. The figure took another step, moving slowly toward me. I fumbled with my phone, desperately trying to get a signal, but there was nothing. I felt trapped on this dark stretch of highway. Just as the figure reached the edge of my headlights, they stopped and stared at me through the windshield. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes watching me. Then, without warning, they turned and walked back to their car. The door slammed shut and the engine roared to life. The car sped off into the night, disappearing down the highway as quickly as it had come. I sat there shaking, trying to make sense of what just happened. My car was still dead, and the highway was dark and empty again. Then, without me touching it, the radio crackled back to life one last time. Stay on Route 67. Do not turn back. I didn't sleep that night. Eventually, another driver passed by, and I was able to get a tow back to the nearest town. I told the mechanic what happened, but he just shrugged and said it was probably a random engine failure. But I knew it wasn't just that. Now I don't drive on Route 67 anymore. I take the long way around, even if it adds hours to my trip. I've never told anyone what happened that night. Not really, because I know they wouldn't believe me. But I can't stop wondering who that voice on the radio was and why it knew what would happen to me. This happened to me a few years ago, and I still think about it every time I drive alone at night. I used to love long drives. There's something calming about being on the open road, especially late at night when there's hardly any traffic. But now, I can't drive more than an hour on a highway without feeling that same creeping dread I felt that night. It was around 1 a.m., and I was heading home from a friend's place about 3 hours away. I didn't want to stay the night, so I decided to drive back even though it was late. The highway I took was mostly empty, a 2-lane road through miles of farmland and woods. The occasional car passing by was the only sign of life. About an hour into the drive, I noticed a car behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People drive late all the time. But after a few minutes, I realized the car wasn't passing me. It was just sitting there, matching my speed and staying right behind me no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. I glanced at the rearview mirror to get a better look. It was an older sedan, and its headlights were bright and blinding. I couldn't see the driver's face, just the outline of a figure behind the wheel. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were tired or distracted. But when I sped up a little more, hoping they would pass me or drop back, they didn't. They stayed right on my tail, almost like they were playing a game with me. The weird thing was, there was plenty of room to pass. The highway was wide open with no other cars in sight, yet this person refused to move. I started feeling uneasy. My heart raced as I realized they were intentionally staying behind me. I had heard stories about road rage or people messing with drivers late at night, but I never thought I would be one of those drivers. Finally, I decided to switch lanes and slow down, giving them every chance to pass me. I signaled, changed lanes, and dropped my speed, thinking that would finally make them go around. But they slowed down too, staying directly behind me and matching my every move. At this point, my unease turned into outright fear. I had no idea what this person wanted or why they were following me, but I knew I needed to get away from them. I sped up again, pushing my car well over the speed limit. The highway stretched out ahead of me, long and empty, but the car behind me kept up with every turn and acceleration. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I felt trapped. I couldn't pull over. Stopping on a desolate highway in the middle of the night with someone like this behind me felt like asking for trouble. I couldn't outrun them either. They weren't going anywhere. Then I saw a sign for a rest stop ahead. It wasn't much, just one of those tiny, unlit stops with a single bathroom and a vending machine. But it was something. Maybe if I pulled in, they would just drive past and leave me alone. As I approached the exit, I flicked on my turn signal, hoping the car would continue on the highway. But they didn't. They followed me into the rest stop. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The rest stop was completely empty. No other cars, no lights, just the faint glow from a flickering vending machine. I pulled into a parking spot, my mind racing. I didn't want to get out of the car. I couldn't trust whoever was behind me. But staying here with them felt even worse. As soon as I parked, the car behind me pulled in and stopped a few spaces away. Their headlights were still blinding, and they just sat there, engine idling. I watched them through my rearview mirror, waiting for something to happen. After a few tense moments, the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out, wearing a dark hoodie with his hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't look at my car. Instead, he walked slowly toward the restroom building, his head down like he was just another traveler stopping for a break. But something about the way he moved, so deliberately and never glancing my way, set off alarm bells in my head. He wasn't acting like someone who needed to use the restroom. He was too calm, too intentional. I couldn't stay there. I didn't care what he was planning. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The moment he disappeared behind the restroom building, I slammed my car into reverse, backing out of the parking spot as fast as I could. My tires screeched as I turned back onto the highway, my heart racing as I floored the gas. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man come back out from behind the building, his head snapping toward my car as I sped away. But I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I drove for miles, glancing in my mirrors every few minutes, half expecting to see that car's headlights behind me again. But they never appeared. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a well-lit gas station and parked, my hands still shaking. I stayed in the car for a long time, just trying to calm down and convince myself that I was safe now. I never found out who that man was or why he had followed me for so long. Maybe it was just some guy trying to scare me for a laugh, or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know, but I do know this. I don't drive alone at night anymore. I had been driving for hours down a rural highway when my car suddenly broke down just before sunset. I had no signal on my phone, and I was far from any town. My car started sputtering and then just died on me. Now I was stuck on the side of the road, completely alone. I tried restarting the engine a few times, but nothing happened. At this point, I felt tired and frustrated. I got out and popped the hood, but I wasn't much of a mechanic, so I had no idea what to look for. I noticed some smoke rising from the engine, but that was all. I thought about walking to the nearest town, but I had no clue how far it was. Then I remembered passing a small road a few miles back that led to a driveway. I hoped there might be a house or someone who could help me down that road. I grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and started walking. As the sun set, it got dark quickly. When I reached the small driveway, I saw an old house hidden behind some trees. It looked abandoned, peeling paint, broken windows, and an overgrown yard. I wasn't sure if anyone lived there, but I decided to check anyway. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. The door was slightly open, so I knocked again and waited. Still nothing. Feeling desperate, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was dark and musty, and the only light came from a flickering lamp on a table. It felt strange, but I just wanted help with my car. While I was standing there, I heard footsteps coming from the back of the house. I felt nervous, but I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there? My car broke down, and I need help." No one responded, and the footsteps stopped. I decided to leave. Things were getting too weird, and I felt like I was intruding. But when I turned to leave, I found the door had shut behind me. I hadn't heard it close, and when I tried to open it, it was locked. That's when I started to panic. I looked around for a way out, but the only window was too high to reach. I frantically tried to unlock the door when I heard a low, raspy whisper behind me. "What are you doing here?" I spun around, but no one was there. My heart raced, and I felt like I might faint. I kept trying the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the footsteps again, much closer this time. I turned slowly and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a man. He moved closer, and I could see he was wearing a hood. I backed away trying to stay calm and said, "I'm sorry, I just needed help with my car." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. My fear grew by the second, and I knew I had to do something before he got any closer. In a burst of desperation, I grabbed a heavy vase from the table and threw it at him. It shattered, and the man hesitated for a moment. That was my chance. Somehow, I managed to force the door open and bolted outside. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. My car was still there, but it was getting darker, and I felt completely alone. I sat in my car, locked the doors, and waited for 3 long hours, hoping a car would pass by. Finally, I saw headlights approaching. I got out, waved my flashlight, and flagged the driver down. He was a kind man and offered to drive me to the next town. He dropped me off safely, and I finally had enough phone signal to call a tow truck. Looking back, I realized going into that house was a bad idea, especially since I was uninvited. But I was panicking, and my broken down car left me desperate for help. I hope I never have to go through something like that again. I was driving home late one night, taking the back roads to avoid traffic on the interstate. The night was quiet, and the road was narrow, with thick woods on both sides. It always felt a bit eerie when I was the only one driving on it. Around midnight, I suddenly felt a jolt. My truck swerved a little, but I quickly got it back under control and pulled over to the side of the road. I got out, leaving the engine running to keep the headlights on, and walked to the back. Sure enough, one of the rear tires was completely flat. "Great," I muttered, shaking my head. Luckily, I always kept a spare tire and a jack, so I figured I could change the tire and be on my way quickly. I grabbed the tools and the spare tire and started working. The night was still, almost too still. It was one of those nights where everything felt extra quiet, like the whole world was asleep. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. I told myself I'd be back on the road soon, and there was nothing to worry about. But then I started to hear something strange. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a steady, rhythmic thumping noise, like someone tapping a drum in the distance. I stopped what I was doing and listened, but it stopped as soon as I paid attention. I figured it was just the woods making weird sounds and went back to changing the tire. A minute later, the thumping started again, louder this time. It made me uneasy, but I tried to ignore it and focused on my work. Then I heard something even weirder. Whispers. Faint, almost inaudible whispers coming from the trees. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but just hearing them sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, wiped my hands on my pants, and grabbed my flashlight from the truck. I shined it toward the woods and scanned the trees, but all I could see was darkness. The trees stood tall and still, like silent guards. The whispers continued, just loud enough for me to hear, but too quiet to understand. The thumping grew louder, and my heart began to race. I hurried to finish changing the tire, not wanting to stay out there longer. As I worked, the whispers and thumping seemed to get closer, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. Then I heard it, a low, deep growl from the woods. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. My hands started to shake as I tightened the lug nuts, trying to work faster. I stood up and scanned the woods again with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just more trees and shadows. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of twigs snapping, like something was moving through the trees. I could feel the hair on my neck standing up. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking in the darkness, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. With my hands trembling, I quickly packed up my tools and threw them in the back of the truck. I wanted to get out of there fast. I was almost done when everything suddenly went silent. The growling, the whispers, the thumping, it all stopped just like that. I paused, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. The silence was so intense it felt like the whole world had stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know whether to be relieved or more scared. I took one last glance at the woods, ready to jump into the truck and drive away. That's when I saw it, something moving between the trees. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a shadow darting from one tree to another. It was fast, too fast to see clearly, but I knew it was there. My heart pounded as I tried to figure out what it was. It was too dark to see, but whatever it was big. I didn't wait around to find out. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door shut, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, my hands still shaking. As I pulled back onto the road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. I sped down the road, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was back there. My heart raced the whole drive home, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The whispers, the growls, the shadow. It was like something out of a nightmare. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my driveway, and even then, I sat in the truck for a minute, trying to calm down. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it sometimes. I've driven those back roads since, but nothing like that ever happened again. I don't know what was out there in the woods that night, but whatever it was real. I'll never forget the sound of those whispers, or the sight of that shadow darting between the trees. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I still feel like something is watching me from the woods, just waiting to make its move.